Hi everyone! In this video I'm going to talk about general white blood cell stuff, like what are the white blood cells, what's the terminology we use to classify increases or decreases in white blood cells, and we're going to go into a little bit about how we count white blood cells. So I have pictured here the 5 main white blood cells that we see in blood, and they're further divided into the segmented forms and the mononuclear forms. So we have, with the segmented forms, our neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And all of these are also called granulocytes, and that's because they have lots of granules in their cytoplasm. Within the neutrophils, though, the granules stain really pale, so you don't see the granules very distinctly on a blood smear. But eosinophils have bright red granules, and basophils have blue granules. In the mononuclear forms, there's the monocytes, which, when they enter tissues, they become macrophages. And as well, we have lymphocytes, which are really small cells. So we have specific terminology that we communicate to one another to tell whether a specific cell type is increased or decreased. And that terminology really has 3 suffixes. So if you see a cytosis or a philia, then that means that that cell type is increased. And if you see a penia, a suffix penia, then that cell type is decreased. So, for example, leukocytosis means an increased cell type, and leukopenia means a decreased cell type. A change in neutrophil concentration is denoted by either a neutrophilia or a neutropenia. Lymphocytosis or lymphopenia denotes a change in the lymphocyte concentration. Monocytosis means an increased monocyte concentration, but we really don't have a term for decreased monocytes because oftentimes the reference range goes down to 0. Eosinophilia and eosinopenia mean changes in eosinophil concentrations. And much like there is no monocytopenia, there really also isn't a basopenia because the lower reference range goes to 0, but basophilia indicates an increased basophil concentration. There are 2 different ways of counting the white blood cells in blood, and that's called the relative count and the absolute count. The relative count is a percentage. The absolute count is a per some volume. Oftentimes we use per microliter. So the relative count of the neutrophils in the picture would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 60%. The relative count of the lymphocytes in this picture would be 1, 2, 3, 30%. And the relative count of the eosinophils would be 1, so 10%. Now to get the absolute count, you multiply the relative count times the total white blood cell count. So for the eosinophils, 10% of 10,000 would be 1,000 eosinophils per microliter. The absolute count of the lymphocytes would be 30% of 10,000, which is 3,000 lymphocytes per microliter. And the absolute count of the neutrophils would be 60% of 10,000, which would be 6,000 neutrophils per microliter. So when we're assessing whether a cell type is increased or decreased, you should always use the absolute cell count because that's a better reflection of what those cells are doing in circulation. There are 2 types of hematology analyzers, those that can differentiate white blood cells from nucleated red blood cells, and those that cannot. So if you have an analyzer that is not able to distinguish the 2, then you have to use the corrected white blood cell count formula to identify the true white blood cell count when you have nucleated red cells in circulation. So the analyzer gives you the white blood cell count, which it thinks is the white blood cell count because of course it can't identify NRBCs. So this is the analyzer. And looking at a blood smear, you identify that there are white blood cells in circulation. So you looked at a blood smear and you saw 152 nucleated red blood cells per 100 white blood cells. So what you then do is just plug these two numbers into this formula and it gives you the actual white blood cell count, excluding the nucleated red cells. So with this formula, we can see that there aren't really 152,000 white blood cells, 107,000 white blood cells. There's actually only 42,000 white blood cells.